The morning sun had barely climbed over the glass towers of downtown Atlanta when a woman in a worn gray coat stepped through the revolving doors of the building she had built with her own hands 20 years earlier. Her shoes were flat and comfortable, the kind made for walking rather than impressing. Her hair was pulled back simply, no jewelry catching the light, nothing about her appearance suggesting she belonged anywhere near the marble lobby she now stood in. She carried only a small leather bag, the strap worn thin from years of use, and she moved through the space the way someone moves through a memory, quietly, deliberately, as though counting every tile beneath her feet. The receptionist at the front desk barely lifted her eyes. She saw an older black woman standing near the entrance, hesitant, unremarkable, and she made a decision in that instant that would later replay on every screen in the building. She asked the woman to take a seat because leadership, she said, was extremely busy this morning. What followed over the next 6 minutes would become the most studied sequence of footage in the company's history, a quiet unraveling of arrogance and assumption that no one in that lobby could have predicted, because the woman waiting patiently near the window was not a visitor. She was not a vendor, not an applicant, not someone to be managed and dismissed. She was the founder, the architect of everything inside those walls, and in exactly 6 minutes, the executive floor above her would fall into a silence none of them would ever forget. Naomi Carter had just returned from a 3-week trip overseas, visiting regional offices in London and Singapore, reviewing operations with a kind of hands-on attention that had defined her entire career. She had told no one of her return. No assistant had been informed. No driver had been dispatched. No calendar invite had gone out to warn the people who ran her company day to day that the woman who built it from nothing was about to walk through the front door. This was intentional. Naomi had built Carter Solutions from a single rented office with 3 employees into a corporation valued at over $4 billion, and somewhere along that 2-decade climb, she had learned that the truest picture of a company's culture was never visible in scheduled meetings or polished reports. It revealed itself in the unguarded moments, in the way people treated each other when they believed no one important was watching. So she took a taxi, instead of her own car. She wore the same gray coat she had worn to countless early morning flights, comfortable and unremarkable, and she walked into her own headquarters, carrying nothing that announced her name or her title. The security guard at the entrance gave her a long look, the kind of look that lingers a half-second too long, weighing and measuring in ways he likely did not even register consciously. He asked for identification, which she provided without complaint, watching as he typed her name into a system that should have flagged her instantly, yet somehow did not, because the front desk software had not been updated to reflect her return from international travel. The receptionist, a young woman named Caitlin, who had worked at the company for just over a year, glanced up from her monitor and asked Naomi to sign in at the kiosk. When Naomi explained that she had a meeting with the executive board, Caitlin's expression shifted into something practiced and polite, the kind of customer service smile that exists specifically to manage people deemed lesser. She asked, somewhat reflexively, whether Naomi was there for a job interview or perhaps a delivery that needed to be signed for at the loading dock instead. Naomi simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that revealed nothing of what she was thinking, and she repeated that she had an appointment with the people who ran this company. Caitlin did not believe her. There was no entry in the visitor log under that name. No executive assistant had called ahead, and so she did what protocol dictated. She gestured toward the waiting area near the window, told Naomi that someone would be with her shortly, and returned her attention to her screen as though the matter had been fully resolved. Naomi walked to the leather chair by the window and sat down, setting her small bag in her lap, and from that vantage point, she could see almost the entire lobby. She could see the elevator banks where employees badged in and out with quiet efficiency. She could see the security desk, where guards monitored a wall of small screens, screens that recorded everything, every entrance, every exchange, every dismissive glance. She knew, because she had approved the installation of that exact security system years earlier, that every second of what was about to unfold would be captured in high definition, time-stamped, and unbroken. She did not check her phone. She did not appear impatient or wounded by the treatment she had just received. She simply watched, the way she had always watched, cataloging details with the same quiet attentiveness that had once allowed her to spot a flaw in a contract that 3 lawyers had missed, or notice a pattern of late shipments that no one else had connected. Within the first 90 seconds, she had already memorized the faces of 4 employees who walked past her without a glance, and the face of one young man who would, without knowing it, change the course of his career within the hour. The first 60 seconds passed in near silence, the kind of ordinary corporate quiet, filled with ringing phones and the soft clatter of keyboards. But it was the minute that followed which began to reveal something deeper about the culture humming beneath the surface of Carter Solutions. A senior director walked through the lobby with a tablet under his arm, moving quickly toward the elevators, and his eyes passed over Naomi, the way eyes pass over furniture, present but unworthy of acknowledgement. He did not nod. He did not offer the small courtesy of recognition that most professionals extend instinctively to anyone sitting in a company lobby, visitor, or otherwise. He simply continued on his path, already speaking into his phone about a vendor contract, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never once questioned his own importance in a room. Naomi watched him go, filing his name away from the badge clipped to his belt, though she had recognized him the moment he stepped off the elevator. He had been with the company for 6 years. A security guard near the elevator bank approached her next, not with hostility exactly, but with the brisk efficiency of someone enforcing a rule he did not fully understand the purpose of. He informed her that visitors were required to remain within the designated waiting zone, gesturing toward a roped section of seating she had not realized existed until that moment, though she had certainly sat exactly where she was supposed to be. She thanked him for the information and did not move, because she had not actually left her seat, and something in the exchange told her that the instruction was less about her location and more about reminding her of her place within an invisible hierarchy that had nothing to do with company policy. Meanwhile, at the front desk, Caitlin's attention had shifted entirely toward a well-dressed man who had just entered, someone whose suit alone seemed to announce his importance, and she rose from her seat to greet him personally, walking him to a private elevator reserved for VIP guests, all while Naomi remained seated less than 20 feet away, invisible in the particular way that power renders certain people invisible to those who have not yet learned to look past appearances. It was at the 4-minute mark that Richard Donnelly, the company's chief operating officer, stepped out of the elevator with the kind of stride that belonged to a man who had never once doubted his welcome in any room he entered. Someone, perhaps Caitlin, had mentioned offhand that an older woman had been waiting in the lobby for several minutes without an appointment, and Richard, ever the gatekeeper of efficiency, decided to handle the matter himself rather than delegate it further down the chain. He approached Naomi with his hands in his pockets, looking her over from her flat shoes to her simple coat, with an expression that contained no malice exactly, only the casual disregard of a man accustomed to sorting people quickly into categories of useful and not useful. He asked her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, where her application paperwork was, assuming, as so many in that lobby already had, that a black woman in plain clothing, sitting quietly near the window, must be there seeking employment rather than possessing it. A junior employee standing nearby laughed softly at the comment, the kind of laugh that exists to align oneself with whoever holds power in a given moment, and Naomi felt the weight of that laughter settle into the room like something physical. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice or correct him on the spot, though she could have ended the entire charade with a single sentence. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and met Richard's eyes with a calm that unsettled him slightly, though he could not have said why. She told him simply that she was waiting to speak with the leadership team, and that she was certain someone would be down shortly to assist her. Richard shrugged, already turning away, already dismissing her from his thoughts, as he checked his watch and muttered something about needing to get back upstairs for a call. He never asked her name. In the 6 years he had spent rising through the ranks of Carter Solutions, attending every all-hands meeting, sitting through every town hall where the company's founding story was retold, he had apparently never once looked closely enough at the framed photographs in the executive hallway to recognize the woman who now sat 10 feet away from him, quietly committing his name to memory alongside the others. The 5th minute brought Melissa Grant, the company's chief marketing officer, striding through the lobby with the particular urgency of someone perpetually 15 minutes late to something important. She glanced at Naomi only briefly, long enough to register her presence and form an instant assumption, and she asked, without breaking stride, whether Naomi was there about a charitable donation request, perhaps representing some community organization seeking corporate sponsorship. The question was not asked cruelly so much as carelessly, the kind of assumption that reveals itself only when examined later, under harsh light, born from a lifetime of unconscious sorting that told Melissa exactly what kind of person sits quietly in a lobby asking to speak with leadership. Naomi answered that she was not there for a donation, and Melissa, satisfied with whatever explanation she had already constructed in her mind, continued on toward the elevators without waiting for further clarification. Victor Reyes, the chief financial officer, arrived moments later, his tone considerably sharper than the others, informing Naomi flatly that the company did not entertain unscheduled visits and that she would need to contact the office to arrange a proper appointment before anyone could see her. There was an edge of irritation in his voice, as though her mere presence in the lobby constituted an inconvenience to his morning, a disruption to the carefully ordered world he inhabited several floors above, where decisions about budgets and layoffs were made in rooms she had never personally needed to enter because she had built the entire structure that allowed those rooms to exist. But amid this quiet parade of dismissal, something different happened, something Naomi would remember long after the morning had ended. A young man named Marcus Webb, an entry-level associate in the operations department who had been with the company for less than a year, noticed her sitting alone and approached with a paper cup of water, offering it gently and asking if there was anything else she needed while she waited. He did not know who she was. He simply saw an older woman sitting quietly in a lobby being passed over by busy executives, and something in him, some unspoiled instinct for basic decency, compelled him to act. He pulled a chair slightly closer and asked if her appointment was running behind schedule, apologizing on behalf of a company that had not yet earned the right to his apology, and when Naomi thanked him, he simply nodded and returned to his desk without expecting anything in return. Naomi watched him walk away and felt something settle in her chest, a small but important confirmation that not everyone inside these walls had forgotten what she had once tried to build the entire company around: the simple, unglamorous practice of treating people with respect, regardless of what they appeared to be able to offer you. What Naomi did not yet know, sitting there in the lobby, with her hands folded calmly in her lap, was that 2 floors above her, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline, the very executives who had just dismissed her in the lobby were gathering for a meeting that would reveal exactly how far the company's culture had drifted from the principles she had spent 2 decades building. The room filled slowly, coffee cups in hand, tablets open to spreadsheets, the casual chatter of people who believed themselves entirely secure in their positions. Richard Donnelly took his seat at the head of the table, scrolling through a presentation labeled with a deceptively bland title, something about organizational restructuring and operational efficiency, language carefully chosen to obscure the human cost buried within its slides. The meeting began, with Victor Reyes presenting quarterly projections, his tone clipped and confident as he walked through numbers that painted a picture of healthy but not extraordinary growth. He suggested, almost casually, that the easiest path toward improving margins before the next shareholder report would be a significant reduction in workforce, beginning with the customer service and operations divisions, the very departments where employees like Marcus Webb spent their days handling the unglamorous work that kept the company functioning. He proposed cutting nearly 2,000 positions, framing the decision in the language of efficiency and competitive positioning, never once mentioning the families who depended on those paychecks, the mortgages and tuition payments and medical bills that would go unpaid because a spreadsheet suggested the numbers might look better on paper. Melissa Grant nodded along, adding her own suggestion that employee healthcare contributions could be quietly reduced in the coming fiscal year, a change she described as a modest adjustment to benefit structure, though anyone reading the fine print would recognize it as a direct cut to coverage that thousands of families relied upon. And then, almost as an afterthought, Richard raised the matter of executive compensation, suggesting that given the difficult decisions ahead, it would only be appropriate for senior leadership to receive a retention bonus, a reward for the burden of overseeing such painful but necessary cuts. The number he proposed was substantial, enough to cover the salaries of dozens of the employees they were preparing to eliminate, and not one person in that room raised an objection. Thomas Whitfield nodded along as the figures scrolled past on the screen, occasionally jotting a note in the margin of his printed agenda, treating the entire conversation with the same detached efficiency he might apply to approving new office furniture. There was no debate about alternatives, no discussion of trimming executive travel budgets or delaying the planned renovation of the top-floor lounge, no consideration given to the dozens of smaller, less painful adjustments that might have spared even a fraction of the positions on the chopping block. The language in the room had long since drifted into a kind of comfortable abstraction, numbers and percentages standing in for the faces of people who would soon receive an email informing them their final paycheck would arrive within 2 weeks. Naomi, still seated in the lobby below, had no way of hearing the specifics of this conversation in real time, but she had spent enough years inside corporate boardrooms to understand exactly how these discussions unfolded, the particular cadence of language executives used when they were preparing to hurt people while protecting themselves. What she would soon learn, through channels far more reliable than overheard conversation, confirmed everything she had begun to suspect the moment Richard had asked her for an application form. The company she had built to prove that integrity and profitability were not mutually exclusive had, in her absence, begun quietly abandoning the very values that had made its growth possible in the first place. It was not simply the disrespect shown to her personally that troubled Naomi as she sat in that lobby chair, turning the morning over in her mind, with the same careful analysis she applied to every difficult business decision. It was the recognition that the disrespect was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of something far more dangerous, spreading through the upper levels of her company, a culture that had quietly redefined what leadership meant, prioritizing appearance and assumption over substance and character. She thought of the early years, when Carter Solutions had operated out of a cramped office above a hardware store, when she herself had answered every incoming call, packed every outgoing shipment, and treated every single person who walked through the door, whether a potential investor or a delivery driver, with the same baseline respect she would want extended to herself. She had built the company on a simple, unspoken rule that talent and decency could come from anywhere, that judging a person's worth by their appearance was not only morally wrong but practically foolish, a failure of observation that cost businesses far more than they ever realized. Somewhere in the years she had spent expanding into new markets, hiring senior executives from competitor firms, delegating authority to people who had never sat in that cramped office above the hardware store, that founding principle had eroded, replaced by exactly the kind of hierarchy she had spent her career trying to dismantle. At precisely 6 minutes after she had first taken her seat, Naomi reached into her small leather bag and withdrew her phone. She did not call anyone. She did not raise her voice or demand to see a manager, as so many wronged customers might in a similar situation. Instead, she typed a single message to Diane Castellano, the longtime secretary of the company's board of directors, a woman who had worked alongside Naomi since the earliest days of the company and who possessed the authority to summon every member of the executive leadership team and the board itself on a moment's notice. The message was short and unambiguous. It requested an emergency meeting of the full board and senior leadership, effective immediately, in the largest conference room on the executive floor. Diane, recognizing the gravity of such a request coming from Naomi herself, did not ask questions. She simply began making calls. Within 90 seconds, phones began buzzing throughout the executive floor, the particular urgent vibration that signals something has gone seriously wrong. Richard Donnelly's phone lit up first, interrupting the meeting still underway in the glass conference room, and he frowned at the notification, irritated by the disruption to his carefully constructed presentation on workforce reductions. Melissa checked her own phone moments later, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to genuine confusion as she read the message a second time, certain there must be some mistake. Victor Reyes set down his tablet entirely, staring at the summons with the particular unease of a man who has spent his career carefully avoiding situations he cannot control. None of them understood what was happening. There had been no warning, no scheduled emergency session on anyone's calendar, no indication that the comfortable rhythm of their morning was about to be violently interrupted. The CEO, Thomas Whitfield, who had been seated quietly at the far end of the table, reviewing the workforce reduction figures with quiet satisfaction, felt a flicker of irritation cross his face as he read the message himself. Already composing in his mind the comment he intended to make about people who disrupted important meetings without proper protocol. None of them yet understood that the protocol they so reflexively trusted had already failed them in ways they could not yet imagine, 6 floors down, in a lobby chair by the window. The door to the executive conference room opened with a soft mechanical hiss, and every head at the long glass table turned toward the sound, expecting perhaps a panicked junior staffer or an urgent message from legal. Instead, the woman in the worn gray coat from the lobby stepped quietly into the room, her small leather bag still tucked beneath her arm, her expression composed and unreadable. For a brief, suspended moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough for confusion to ripple visibly across several faces before Thomas Whitfield, the company's CEO, rose halfway out of his seat with undisguised irritation coloring his voice, demanding to know who had allowed an unauthorized visitor into a closed executive session, his tone carrying the particular sharpness of a man accustomed to having every door opened only for him. It was Diane Castellano who answered, stepping into the room directly behind Naomi, with a composure that immediately signaled this was no accident, no security breach to be apologized for, and corrected. She addressed the room with the formal precision befitting 20 years of service to the company's board, announcing simply that she wished to introduce the chairwoman and founder of Carter Solutions, the woman whose name appeared on the original incorporation documents, still framed in the lobby downstairs, the very lobby in which several people now seated at this table had spent the past 6 minutes treating her as though she did not belong within these walls. The room did not merely fall silent, it seemed to collapse inward, the air thickening with a recognition that arrived too late to undo what had already happened. Richard Donnelly felt the blood drain visibly from his face, his mind racing backward through the exact words he had used in the lobby. The casual question about application paperwork, now echoing in his ears with a horror he had not anticipated feeling this early in his morning. Melissa Grant pressed her hand briefly against her mouth, unable to summon a single word, her earlier assumption about charitable donations replaying itself with mortifying clarity. Victor Reyes rose from his chair entirely, as though standing might somehow reverse the previous several minutes, his sharp dismissal of an unscheduled visitor now revealing itself as something far more consequential than mere rudeness. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She walked to the head of the table, the seat that had remained technically hers even in her long absences, and she set her small bag down with the same unhurried calm she had carried throughout the entire morning. She looked around the room slowly, taking in each face individually, allowing the silence to do work that words could not have accomplished as effectively. Thomas Whitfield, still standing awkwardly near his chair, attempted to recover some semblance of authority, beginning a sentence about how honored the leadership team was by her unannounced visit, his voice carrying a brittleness that betrayed how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath him in the span of a single sentence from Diane Castellano. Naomi simply held up one hand, not unkindly, but with enough quiet finality that the half-formed apology died in his throat. She informed the room that she intended to revisit the events of the past 6 minutes, not from memory or hearsay, but from the security footage that had captured every moment of her time in the lobby below. She requested that the footage be displayed on the large screen mounted along the far wall of the conference room, the same screen that had likely displayed countless presentations about quarterly earnings and market positioning, now repurposed to display something far more uncomfortable, the unedited truth of how this company's leadership treated a person they believed held no power over their futures. A junior IT staffer, summoned hastily by Diane, connected the security feed with trembling hands, clearly aware that he was about to broadcast something none of the people in this room wished to see again. The footage began to play, time-stamped and unforgiving, beginning with the moment Naomi had first walked through the revolving doors in her worn gray coat. The room watched in silence as Caitlin directed her toward the waiting area, dismissing her question about leadership with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly performed this particular dismissal many times before, toward many different people who did not fit a narrow and unspoken image of who belonged inside these walls. They watched the senior director walk past without acknowledgement, his eyes sliding over Naomi as though she occupied no more significance than the potted plants flanking the elevator bank. They watched the security guard redirect her toward a roped section of seating, enforcing an invisible hierarchy under the guise of simple policy. They watched Caitlin rise eagerly to escort a different visitor, a well-dressed man whose suit alone had apparently qualified him for personal attention, while Naomi remained seated less than 20 feet away. Then came Richard's appearance on screen, his casual stride toward the lobby chair, his pointed question about application paperwork, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered that the woman before him might hold his entire career in her hands. The laughter of the junior employee beside him played clearly through the conference room speakers, an uncomfortable sound now stripped of whatever social context had made it seem acceptable in the moment. Richard, watching himself on the screen, seemed to physically shrink in his chair, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated. Melissa's question about charitable donations followed, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of condescension that she had not noticed in herself until hearing it played back. Victor's sharp dismissal came next, his irritated tone about unscheduled visits now revealing itself not as professional efficiency, but as something considerably uglier, a reflexive cruelty extended towards someone he had decided, within seconds and without evidence, did not deserve basic courtesy. And then, in stark contrast to everything that preceded it, the footage showed Marcus Webb approaching with a simple cup of water, his quiet kindness rendered almost luminous against the backdrop of everything that had come before. No one in the room said a word as this final piece of footage played out, the simple act of human decency, standing as a silent indictment of everyone else who had walked past without a second glance. When the screen finally went dark, the silence that followed was different from the silence that had greeted Naomi's entrance. Heavier now, weighted with the particular discomfort of people forced to confront the gap between who they believed themselves to be and who the footage had just revealed them to be. There was no need for argument, no opportunity for any of them to claim the moment had been exaggerated or misunderstood. The evidence had spoken with a clarity that made denial impossible, and every person at that table understood, in the marrow of their bones, that something irreversible had just occurred. Naomi allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before she finally spoke again, her voice steady and measured, carrying none of the anger that might have been justified, but instead something colder and more precise, the particular calm of someone who had already decided exactly what needed to happen next. She turned first to Thomas Whitfield, asking him plainly how he understood his own responsibility for the culture that had just played out on screen, a culture that had allowed his most senior executives to treat an unidentified visitor with open contempt within the very lobby that bore the company's name. Thomas attempted to explain that he could not personally monitor every interaction within the building, that such matters typically fell under the purview of human resources and facilities management, his voice trailing into something weaker as he registered how hollow the explanation sounded even to his own ears. Naomi reminded him, without raising her voice, that culture was not something that simply happened to a company. It was something built, deliberately, from the top down, through every decision a leader made about who deserved respect and who did not, and that the footage they had all just watched represented years of unchecked tone setting at the highest levels of the organization. She turned next to the head of human resources, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had remained largely silent throughout the meeting, and asked her directly how the hiring and training protocols under her department had failed to prevent such a fundamental breakdown in basic professional conduct. Patricia attempted to point toward existing diversity and inclusion training modules that all employees were required to complete annually, Modules, she insisted, addressed exactly this kind of unconscious bias. But Naomi pressed further, asking whether anyone had ever been held accountable for violating the spirit of that training, whether a single performance review had ever reflected the kind of behavior just witnessed on screen. Patricia had no answer, because there was none to give. The training existed as a formality, a box checked for legal compliance, entirely disconnected from any meaningful enforcement or consequence. Victor Reyes was next, and Naomi addressed him with a particular sharpness reserved for the financial decisions she had overheard secondhand through Diane's careful inquiries in the minutes before this meeting began. She asked him to explain the proposed workforce reduction plan he had been presenting just moments before her arrival, the elimination of nearly 2,000 positions, paired with a substantial executive retention bonus for the very leadership team responsible for the decision. Victor attempted to frame the cuts in the language of necessary efficiency, the same careful corporate vocabulary he had used in the meeting before her interruption, but Naomi cut through the framing immediately, asking him plainly whether he believed it was ethical to enrich executive leadership at the precise moment thousands of working families were being told their positions no longer existed. Victor had no satisfactory answer, because the arithmetic of his proposal had never been designed to survive that particular question. One by one, Naomi moved through the room, asking each person to account for their role in a culture that had drifted so far from the principles upon which this company had been built. She did not raise her voice with any of them, and somehow that restraint made each question land harder than shouting ever could have. She asked the chief marketing officer, Melissa Grant, why her first assumption about an unfamiliar black woman sitting quietly in the lobby had been that she must be soliciting charity rather than conducting business, and whether that same instinct had ever shaped decisions about which voices were featured in the company's advertising campaigns or which communities were targeted for outreach. Melissa stammered through an answer about unconscious patterns and promised immediate reflection, but the promise rang hollow against the footage still fresh in everyone's memory. None of them could offer an answer that survived real scrutiny, because the truth, laid bare by 6 minutes of unforgiving footage and a handful of pointed questions, was simply that comfort and unchecked authority had eroded the values that once defined this place. The silence that followed each unanswered question grew heavier than the last, until the room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion that everyone could already sense approaching. When the questioning concluded, Naomi did not raise her voice or deliver an emotional speech about betrayal. She simply opened a folder Diane had prepared in advance, containing termination documents that had clearly been drafted with remarkable speed and precision, and she began signing her name across each page with the same steady hand that had once signed the company's very first incorporation papers 2 decades earlier. Thomas Whitfield's termination was effective immediately. Patricia Hale's followed. Victor Reyes watched his own name appear beneath Naomi's signature. The position he had spent 15 years climbing toward dissolved within the span of a single morning. Richard Donnelly, who had asked her for application paperwork less than an hour earlier, found himself escorted from the building by security before the lunch hour arrived, his access badge deactivated before he had even reached the parking garage. The following week, Naomi requested that every remaining employee gather in the building's largest auditorium, a space typically reserved for quarterly town halls, filled with carefully rehearsed presentations and polished optimism. This gathering carried a different weight entirely. She walked onto the stage without notes, without a slideshow, without the practiced confidence of someone delivering a message crafted by a communications team. She simply stood before her employees, hundreds of them filling the seats, uncertain what to expect after a week of rumors and reorganization that had rippled through every department. She did not begin with anger or accusation. Instead, she told them about the earliest days of the company, the cramped office above the hardware store, the 18-hour days she had worked answering phones and packing boxes alongside 3 employees who believed in a vision that had not yet proven itself to anyone outside that small room. She told them, with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself in professional settings, about the dozens of investors who had turned her away in those early years, citing vague concerns about market readiness that she later understood, with painful clarity, had far more to do with the color of her skin and the unfamiliarity of seeing a black woman seeking serious capital than with any genuine flaw in her business plan. She described sitting in conference rooms, not unlike the one upstairs, watching men in expensive suits exchange glances that suggested her presence at the table was itself an anomaly to be tolerated rather than a perspective to be valued. She recalled one investor in particular, a man who had kept her waiting for nearly an hour past their scheduled appointment before finally meeting with her for less than 10 minutes, asking questions clearly designed to confirm a conclusion he had already reached before she ever walked through his door. She told the room that she had left that meeting and driven straight to the small office above the hardware store, sat down at her desk, and made herself a promise that she would build something different, something that judged people by what they actually did, rather than by the assumptions strangers formed about them in the first few seconds of an introduction. She told them that she had never once allowed those experiences to harden her into someone who treated others the way she had been treated, because she understood, even in her most discouraged moments, that meeting cruelty with cruelty simply multiplied the harm rather than ending it. The principle she had tried to build this entire company around was simple enough to fit on a single sentence: that a company existed because of its people, not its titles, not its hierarchy, not the size of an executive's office or the exclusivity of a parking space. She spoke directly about Marcus Webb, asking him to stand if he was present in the audience. And when he rose, visibly uncertain why he had been singled out, she told the entire room what he had done in those 6 minutes. When no one believed anyone of consequence was watching, she announced, to scattered applause that grew steadily louder as the weight of the moment settled over the room, that Marcus would be promoted into a leadership development program specifically designed to identify and elevate employees who demonstrated the kind of quiet integrity that no training module could manufacture. She made clear that this was not a reward for kindness performed strategically, but a recognition that the qualities making someone a decent human being and the qualities making someone an effective leader were, more often than not, exactly the same. 3 months passed, and the transformation within Carter Solutions became visible in ways that extended well beyond the executive suite. New leadership was brought in, individuals carefully vetted not merely for their resumes, but for the way they treated people across every level of the organization, from senior vice presidents down to the security guards stationed in the lobby each morning. The new chief operating officer, a woman who had spent the early years of her career working customer service shifts before climbing steadily into management, insisted on personally greeting new hires during their first week, a small gesture that nonetheless rippled outward through the entire culture of the building. Employee satisfaction scores, which had been declining steadily for several years under the previous administration's quiet cultural neglect, climbed sharply within a single quarter. Turnover rates, particularly among entry-level and customer-facing staff who had borne the brunt of the company's eroded culture, dropped to levels not seen since the company's earliest years. Profitability, which Victor Reyes had once insisted depended on workforce reduction and benefit cuts, actually improved, a fact that surprised analysts but did not surprise Naomi in the slightest, because she had long understood something the previous leadership team had conveniently forgotten: that companies built on genuine respect for their people tended to retain talent, reduce costly turnover, and inspire a kind of loyalty that no spreadsheet could fully quantify. Naomi did not commission a portrait of herself for the lobby. She did not rename the building or commission a statue to commemorate the morning she had walked back into her own company and found it wanting. The single change she insisted upon, the only physical alteration she requested in the wake of everything that had happened, was that every new employee, regardless of position or department, would watch those 6 minutes of unedited security footage during their very first week of orientation. This was not, she made clear in every conversation about the decision, intended as a public shaming of the executives who had since departed the company, their names long since faded from the building's memory. It existed instead as a reminder, deliberately uncomfortable, that an entire culture could reveal itself in the span of 6 brief minutes, that the way a company treated someone it believed held no power said everything about who that company truly was when the cameras were rolling and the consequences felt distant, On the morning she finally left her office for what would be an extended return to international travel, Naomi walked through the same lobby she had entered weeks earlier in her worn gray coat, carrying the same small leather bag, moving with the same unhurried, quiet dignity that had once gone entirely unnoticed by the people responsible for greeting visitors at the door. But this time, every employee she passed rose from their seat or paused in their conversation to acknowledge her, not out of obligation or fear, but out of something that had been rebuilt slowly and deliberately over 3 difficult months, a genuine respect earned not through fear of consequence, but through the demonstrated proof that this company, under her leadership, valued people rather than as categories to be sorted and dismissed. Marcus Webb, now several months into his leadership program, offered her a small nod from across the room, and Naomi returned it with a warmth that needed no further words. She paused briefly, near the revolving doors, looking back at the lobby one final time, before stepping out into the morning light. And what struck her most was not the marble floors, or the gleaming reception desk, or any of the physical markers of success that had once defined how this company measured itself. It was the quiet, ordinary decency, now visible in the simple exchanges happening around her. A security guard offering directions with genuine patience, a receptionist greeting an uncertain visitor with warmth rather than suspicion. Small moments that would never appear in any quarterly earnings report, but that represented, in Naomi's mind, the truest measure of everything she had spent 20 years building. She thought briefly of the framed photograph still hanging in the executive hallway upstairs, the one taken on the day she had signed the lease for that first cramped office above the hardware store. 3 employees crowded around her, none of them imagining the size of what they were beginning. She thought of every door that had once closed in her face, every investor who had looked past her toward someone they found more familiar, every assumption that had tried, in ways large and small, to define the limits of what she was permitted to build. None of it had broken her, and in the end, none of it had even slowed her down, because she had refused, again and again, to let cruelty teach her how to treat other people. The deepest power any leader could hold, she had come to understand long before that morning in the gray coat, but never more clearly than in its aftermath, was never the ability to punish those who had wronged her. It was the patient, deliberate work of building a place where every single person, regardless of how they appeared on a given morning, regardless of the assumptions strangers might form within the first 6 seconds of meeting them, could walk through the door and be treated, simply and completely, like they belonged. The taxi she had arrived in weeks earlier was long gone from memory, replaced now by a car waiting curbside, though she still preferred, more often than not, to walk the first few blocks alone before being driven anywhere at all. It was a small habit, hardly worth mentioning to anyone who asked, but it kept her close to the ground she had built everything upon, close enough to remember exactly what it felt like to be overlooked, and close enough to make certain that no one else within these walls would ever have to sit quietly by a window, waiting 6 long minutes to be seen.